Welcome to the Online Great Books podcast, brought to you by OnlineGreatBooks.com, where we talk about the good life, the great books, great conversation, and great ideas.
Hello, dear listener. This is Brad. I'm the producer of the Online Great Books podcast. Welcome back to the show. And this week, Scott and Karl begin their two-part discussion on John Dewey's, you can hear it in my voice, the disdain, John Dewey's essay, Challenge to Liberal Thought. You know, they say, this is advice for podcasters, that when you're recording, you should smile, even when you're talking about John Dewey. So I'm going to try to do that throughout the rest of this, and which should make me more likable and relatable as I talk to you about something that I really dislike. This is from the later works collection of essays, volume 15. Did this guy ever shut up? There's early works, middle works, and later works, and 17 total volumes in the later works, each composed of at least a dozen essays. And I'm going to go back to smiling now. I assume that most of the listeners to this show are familiar with John Dewey. Dewey was an educational reformer. He was active throughout the first half of the 20th century and definitely left a very significant, very progressive mark on public schooling in the United States of America, and I would say beyond. My past work devoted a lot of time and energy to criticism of Dewey's creations. So I'm just going to excuse myself here and pass the mic to Scott and Karl. And you know, when I first heard they were going to cover Dewey, my impulse was to ask if I could join them for the conversation. And I'm so glad I did not do that. It would have just been too much torment. And believe me not being there does not save you from torment. It's coming. But it would have just been too much torment, I think, the three of us going at Dewey. This particular essay focuses on his criticisms of the great books of the Western world enterprise. But obviously, the conversation expands to his larger social, educational, and political philosophy. And it's a mess. And so, with that enticement, here is part one of Scott and Karl's response to John Dewey's challenge to liberal thought. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your time and attention. And here we go.
I'm Scott Hambrick.
I'm Karl Sheet.
They already know what we're going to read. Are we going to be ready for the Silmarillion in 2 weeks?
I hope so. I was listening to it in the car yesterday. It's so good.
I have mixed feelings about that. Feels so dirty.
About me listening in the car?
Yeah.
Well, I have an infinity pile, and I have to do things. And so
me too.
I do a lot of driving. I can get a lot done. The only problem is I can't take notes. So I have a very nice copy of it with pictures in it. I think they're actual photos because this is true history.
Right, it's true.
But I'm going to have to go back and jot down notes. But just to go through all the stories and refresh my memory, I can go in a car.
I do orientations for new members at Online Great Books, you know, and I often am asked about note taking. Like, how do you take notes? How do you prepare for seminar? And I tell them, I just let Karl do that. And then when he brings up something, I know that he's going to bring up the important bits. And then I just make fart jokes and say stuff about what he made notes about.
Yeah, I take a lot of notes.
That's perfect. It saves me a lot of work. I appreciate it.
And I take a lot of notes, but I don't usually use them. I think the process of taking notes, if you do it right, it frees you from the need to use them. It's like doing technical exercises for piano or trumpet or French horn. I guess they probably have those. It's hard to tell.
It is hard to tell.
Well, you're so high up in the harmonics, you hardly need to press down buttons anyway.
Yeah, and then all the buttons are tied to things with strings. It's the sloppiest, dumbest instrument in the world.
And it points backwards.
Yeah.
But once you master the technique, you don't really think about it. And so when you have a text and you've taken notes on your thoughts, hopefully it takes shape in your mind as one thing, and you can talk about it and not worry about, well, where's my note on that? So over prepare, and then don't use your preparation.
I think the notes are part of active reading. When I'm taking notes, well, I'm active. I'm not just passive. The reading then requires me to do something when I'm taking the notes, and that seems to make the reading comprehension go up.
In my little bit of free time, I do novels, mostly Space Marines, and that's a lot more passive. I'm not really taking notes. Or if I was rereading some Terry Pratchett, I'm not tracing out Vetinari's evolution over the book. I'm not making cross references, and I'm just letting him talk to me.
Right.
It's a lot more relaxed. But when reading John Dewey, I've had to grind on it a bit.
Oh, I get so relaxed when I read John Dewey.
You do?
My bowels just empty. I get so relaxed. What are we going to read? So we're going to read Silmarillion.
Yeah, as much of it as you manage to do.
I'll jam down through that thing. Yeah, we'll do that. Then what do you want to do after that? I've got some goodies, but I've been shouting them out lately. What do you want to do?
I was thinking there's some big ones we ought to hit. I think, but I have to find a digestible chunk of it. I think we ought to do Decline and Fall, the Roman Empire, not the whole thing.
Listen. I don't want to play just the tip with that book. We need...
yeah, but for a podcast, let me see how big it is.
How big is it? It's feet, not pages.
Okay, the file, the EPUB file is 15.6 megabytes.
It's not... Is it a WAV audio file?
It's an infinite book.
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge.
So just find a chunk of it that would be good. It comes in 4 volumes if you buy the old copies.
And that's the proper way to do it. This thing where we get these 900-page books that are cinder block proportions, it's just so hard to manage. And if you get 4 1.25-inch thick books, it's so much easier to read those things. People are like, oh, I don't like to read. Well, okay, I get it, kind of. But it's almost like everything is conspiring against people's readings, between dopamine hacks and TikTok and just poorly executed books. How the hell are you going to read Decline and Fall in 1 volume?
Yeah, I'm thinking this might be a Hambrick book. Yeah, the memorable series of revolutions which in the course of about 13 centuries gradually undermined and at length destroyed the solid fabric of human greatness may, with some propriety, be divided into the 3 following periods. Well, there you go. It's going to be the series of revolutions that destroyed it.
Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the Modern Library Collection. Complete and unabridged, 3,630 pages.
We might be the first 2 people to read that thing in the last 50 years.
Oh, they read it at the Kennedy School of Government, right? They read the Politics, too, right? They read the Republic, too, right? No, they don't. I've actually talked to some people that went there. They don't. You find a chunk of that. And then I really want to read Albert J. Nock's Memoirs of a Superfluous Man.
Okay.
Have you heard of this?
Just from you.
It's a classic. Everywhere but the rock you live under. He's a curmudgeonly old fellow. It's about education and the changes in society that he had seen over his lifetime. It was written in 1943. It's a good one, and more people should read it. Putting it in front of more people, I think, would be mighty fine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I want to read Asimov's Foundation. Okay. Not because it's a great book. I think it's actually an evil book.
Oh, let's read it.
But it's an easy breezy read, and you get to see people in the far future acting like 1950s, businessmen, smoking cigarettes and calling all the women hun.
Hun.
It's
dame.
Yeah.
Frails.
Yeah, it's funny.
Skirts, broads.
Anyway, I'd like to do that. I've read a whole bunch of him, and well, I'll tell you why I think it's evil at the end of that podcast. And we thought something about, because we're doing some heavy stuff. Of course, there's always more Shelby Foote, except I think I might have him packed away at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Do volume 2 of that. Apparently, I haven't read volume 2. Apparently, the Gettysburg section is a must-read.
Strong. Have you read Killer Angels?
No.
What is that? Michael Shaara, Shaara, wrote a fictionalized sort of account of Gettysburg. Like the military details, and so many of the details in that book are right, but some of the interpersonal dialogue and stuff is dramatized in it. It's in a sketchy space where you're not sure if it's a novel or if it's a true account. I think the movie Gettysburg was based on Killer Angels. A friend of mine, my buddy Ray the plumber, he's like, Hambrick, you've got to read Killer Angels. He said, the wife and I took the kids on a road trip. She cracked the book and started reading aloud to us, and we wouldn't stop to go to the bathroom because it was so good as she was reading aloud. And I took it on the trip. Charity and I went on a trip, and I took that. I laid down in a chair by the pool and read it in one laying, whatever that is. I mean, I read it for like 6.5 hours straight and read the whole thing. I handed it to Charity. I said, "You've got to read this." She did the exact same thing the next day.
Yeah, sure. And also we had talked about perhaps doing more children's literature.
Yeah.
Which is stupid. It's not children's literature. It's books that children can read. Like,
when it's at its
Huckleberry
best,
Finn
yes.
is, yeah, Huck Finn is not children's literature. No. Maybe the ending. But you mentioned, and I thought was a good idea, Little House on the Prairie.
Oh.
Or whatever the first one is in that series.
The first one is Little House in the Big Woods. I love that book, but Little House in the Big Woods is written simply so that children can read it, for sure, like you're talking about. And as you go through her series, the prose is more and more complex and more adult. Not that there are any adult themes, but they're more difficult to read. But Little House in the Big Woods would be good. Little House on the Prairie itself, which I think is the second book, would be good. Either of those. They're so good, Karl. You've never read them, right?
I think I read one of them.
Oh, you didn't love it?
No, it was okay. You'll have to make me love it.
Yeah, I do love them.
I remember Almanzo. Isn't that the father's name?
That's her husband.
Or the husband's name?
That's Laura's husband.
Almanzo.
I don't remember what the dad's name is. She just calls him Pa.
I think she have a house in Minnesota. I think we might have walked through.
The Little House in the Big Woods.
Louisa May Alcott
was in Minnesota, I believe. Oh, that's Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Yeah. Laura Ingalls Wilder. Sorry. See, I'm terrible.
And the Little House on the Prairie is just a little bit north of the Oklahoma border, I think, on the Verdigris River in Kansas, I believe. And then the house that she retired to when she was, an authoress is up there too. You can go by there. They've got Pa's fiddle there. They do.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And then I'll throw another one out there, although I'd have to pick one. And I think I'd pick Magician's Nephew if I was going to pick one.
C.S. Lewis.
Of a Narnia book. Yeah.
I read those forever ago, and I don't know. Everybody gets all shook up by them, gets all excited. I read them a long time ago, but they did not do that to me. So I'll read it again. It's fine. I'm a different person.
They might see some deeper things going on in it. It's just, for me, he suffers so much from being Tolkien's friend, in my mind, because Tolkien has this. I've been reading Silmarillion a bit, and he's got this fantastic letter in the second edition Christopher put in there, the recently deceased Christopher Tolkien. And his dad was so smart and so solid of thought, and has this whole thing constructed from the bottom up And C.S. Lewis, who, has many fine qualities, but world building's not one of them. Nothing quite makes sense. They're just kind of little. They're good books. They're not great books, and because people group Tolkien and Lewis together, Lewis suffers in the comparison.
I read C.S. Lewis having not read Tolkien.
That's probably the way to do it.
Yeah, and so I did not make that comparison, but my recollection of the Narnia books was that they were sort of tortured. Is a tortured analogy, just front to back. But people will be upset at me for saying that. But that was my impression that I remember. I've read so many other things that he's written, The Great Divorce and Screw Tape and all of those things too. And good on him. It's inexplicable how he remained Anglican. Yeah, it's crazy.
He's from Belfast, wasn't he?
He's from.
There's some Irish Protestant things going on in there, I think. And then I wanted to point out one more thing before we dig into John Dewey. We were talking, before we turned the microphones on, a little bit about Thomas Aquinas. And the thing about Thomas Aquinas is if you have some Latin, you can read him in Latin. And so I had posted a quote on our Slack. And I just want to say that there's a cool trivia thing here. All right. So you know what hypertext markup language is, right? Okay. So that's when you HTML. And when you click on a word and it brings you to other things. One of the first, and perhaps the first, examples of this was the Index to Mysticus, put together by, I believe, a priest. Yeah, Roberto Busa. Started in 1949. IBM agreed to sponsor the project. Can you believe? Oh, it started in 1946, where they took all 10 million words in 56 volumes of the complete works of Thomas Aquinas, hyperlinked so that you could, say you wanted to look up the word analogy, analogia or something, you could click on it and you could search every time it showed up. And if you wanted to search 2 words, you could enter 2 words and search and find every time they came up. And you may think that this is super easy because we have, search engines now. Well, it wasn't super easy in 1946. They had to do it with punch cards. Punch cards. Well, anyway, so the descendant of this, the digital copy of it, is at something called corpustomisticum.org, where you can go and you can get the complete works in Latin of Thomas Aquinas. This is what the internet should be for, instead of the distribution of pornography and day trading.
Yeah.
But it should be for, opera omnia sanctae Thomae. This is very, very cool. And it's not super hard Latin. This is not Cicero. So I just wanted to throw that out there, out into the podcast world. I know some of our people are studying Latin at Slack, at our Slack at Online Great Books. You get a little bit, you do maybe 3 months of Latin, you can poke your way through some Thomas Aquinas.
Sure. Thomas is so good. Ugh. We'll have to we've got to do some of that. Thomas on cardinal virtues, Thomas on natural law, maybe one of the 5 proofs.
Yeah. All right. Do we have to get to Dewey?
No, we could tell knock-knock jokes if you want.
Why'd you make me read this thing?
Well, we have a history of reading garbage on this show that we don't really like. And in the tradition of, sort of intellectual fairness, it's probably good to read people that we don't want to agree with, whether that's Bernays or Dewey. This is the interesting thing. So, okay, for the listener, we read John Dewey, not Thomas Dewey, John Dewey, from a compilation from the Southern Illinois University Press called The Later Works, Volume 15. We read his essay, Challenge to Liberal Thought, where he essentially is attacking I don't know if he's attacking, but he's going at the sort of great books movement and liberal arts education. So we've got this history, me and you, of reading a few things from folks that we don't care for. We've read a little Marcuse. We've read, oh my gosh, Alinsky. Yeah, I was going to say, who's that evil guy? Alinsky. But, so many of these things that we've read, like Alinsky or Bernays, we may not agree with their aims or their worldview, but when read as a technical manual, they're probably dead on.
Mm-hmm.
Dewey is not that. Dewey is not that.
No.
We read H.G. Wells' New World Order. Talked about that on here, I think. This is more sort of in that vein. This utopian managerial approach to society, to social sciences, and it's pretty gross. People throw around the word progressives. Oh, he's a progressive. Well, that's a specific kind of philosophy that came out of Northeastern universities in the late 1800s, early 1900s. John Dewey is maybe the king of the American progressive philosophers, and you don't have to know a lot about progressivism as a school of philosophy, because once you've read this essay, you'll learn a great deal about it. Of course, there's thousands and thousands of pages written by Dewey and others, but this kind of encapsulates their whole attitude and approach to managing people.
Yeah, well, maybe we ought to see what he has to say. I just wrote at the top of my page, I did some math, I think I did this right, that he was 85 when he wrote this.
Sounds right.
Which makes it a little bit better, because I think it is, in fact, an attack on Hutchins, and Hutchins, has avenues of attack, for sure, but we'll see what you think, dear listener.
So, okay. Down at the bottom of that first page here, it says that this was first published in Fortune magazine, and then it says that Alexander Meiklejohn replied to this. And Meiklejohn was one of these great book guys. He's in there kind of with Stringfellow Barr and Scott Buchanan and Hutchins and Adler and Erskine. So he's one of that first group of these. So there's no question maybe it's not an attack directly on Maynard Hutchins, but it's definitely an attack on that movement as seen at St. John's, Columbia, and University of Chicago basic program. And it volleys back and forth several times. So Meiklejohn replies to this, and then Dewey replies to the reply.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I suppose I could trace that out if I wanted to. Well, no, I'm frustrated. I'll save it, but I'm frustrated because I think he makes a big blunder.
Oh, I know. Let's see if we agree on what that is. Shall I write it on a piece of paper, and then you write it on one? We'll just hold it up.
Sure. We'll figure it out. I bet we have the same idea. I do like his first sentence. So there's that. There is probably no better way to realize what philosophy is about when it is living, not antiquarian, than to ask ourselves what criteria and what aims and ideals should control our educational policies and undertakings. Okay, so if you want to know what a philosophy actually is, I think this is actually right. I think Dewey's right on this, except the answers he gives are wrong. Is you say, okay, Mr. Platonist, okay, Spinozist, how would you educate children? They'll tell you, and that will tell you what the philosophy really is.
Yeah.
You could probably do the reverse and figure out you could look at the way people are educating your children and figure out, reverse engineer what their philosophy is. What they think your children ought to know and what they think your children ought to be forced, because that's what compulsory schooling does, to do, will tell you what they really think is important.
His self-awareness is close to zero. Because if you work backwards from his educational approach, you eventually get to his conception of man or the individual or the human. And it is dehumanized. He doesn't have a lot of respect for humans. I mean, he just doesn't. You know, you'll hear so much stuff in political discourse. If you guys don't like my political opining, just beat it, all right? Shut up. I don't want to hear about it. The whole internet is for people that don't agree with me. Like, this is the only place where people agree with me talk. This when people say the elites, this is what they're talking about. He wants to offer people a limited kind of education, which really isn't even an education. It's a training, but that wouldn't be for him. See, he's an elite, so he gets to have a real education. And the people like him get to have a real education. And then through having that real education, they end up being the governing class. So when you hear people throw around, oh, the elites, this is kind of where that comes from. Because we used to have a word that might have been used in that case, aristocracy. That's not what this is. That's not what this is.
A genuine aristocracy, or a genuine one, not, the Kennedys, or a genuine aristocracy is ruled by the best. Well, it presupposes that you know what counts as the best, and in what way John Dewey was the best. Well, Walker Percy would make fun of B.F. Skinner for saying that everyone in the world can be explained through operant, behaviorism, through behavioral conditioning.
Right, except B.F. Skinner.
Except B.F. Skinner. Well, everyone ought to be educated in terms of science and the increase of material goods, except John Dewey.
Instead of me going on about John Dewey, maybe we should do some John Dewey. He says, we are told that scientific subjects have been encroaching upon literary subjects which alone are truly humanistic. We are told that zeal for the practical and utilitarian has resulted in the displacement of a liberal education by one that is merely vocational, one that narrows the whole man down to that fraction of his being concerned with making a living. We are told that the whole tendency is away from the humane to the materialistic, from the permanently rational to the temporarily expedient, and so on.
Yeah, we are told. I wish he would give names and quotes. I wish he would give specific statements. But sure, I actually generally agree with that, except now I think we're not even educated in the vocational.
No, clearly not. Karl and I have both been homeschooling kind of guys, and the most normie of normies will admit, or they'll say, well, the public schooling system was designed to create workers for the Industrial Revolution, and we have to, we've got to get that education up to the times, and the Industrial Revolution. So, like, even normies will admit that the schooling has, in fact, followed Dewey. He wants this to be an expedient vocational training. And here he says, well, we are told, and then some say, and those kinds of things, but that's what he's advocating for. He's actually advocating for all these things that he says he's being accused of. And now here we are in 2022. Well, this essay is 80 years old. I don't know how old it is. Yeah, it's around 80 years old. Everybody knows that those allegations are true.
Well, except I think, let me defend Dewey a little bit here. I think probably modern education hasn't done what he wants. All right, so in this paragraph, this is on page 262, he makes a concession to Hutchins et al. And says, well, we agree that an overloaded and congested curriculum needs simplification. We agree that we're uncertain as to where we're going and where we want to go and why we're doing what we do. But he wants to clarify it, as he says at the end of the essay. But these kids today, they're not getting vocational education. Mm-hmm. They're not even getting that. If they were getting that, it would be better. If you take a high school student, what can he do when he graduates?
I don't know, man.
He can work with the school-supplied Chromebook and do approved activities. I don't know, but they're not doing home economics. They're not doing shop class. They're not doing basic financial understanding. They're not doing reading very well. They're not doing math very well. Those are not vocational.
Well, but Dewey says that this education should match the demands of modern life. right? Am I straw manning him there?
Nope.
Well, I could make an argument that modern life doesn't require a vocational training. Who's working at the GM plant now? Who's working in the steel industry? Who's working like
other countries?
Right. So what vocations are there actually in the United States? Now, we've still got plumbers. We still have electricians.
That's interesting.
We still have HVAC guys. We still have some diesel mechanics, automobile mechanics. There are still some vocations, but not like there was in 1943 when he wrote this. There's a chicken and egg problem. Did we lose industry because people weren't trained for it, or are they not trained for it because we lost it? Well, I don't know. But if you're an educator, a Deweyist educator, do you want to give a high school senior a little elementary industrial science stuff, a little bit of metallurgy? Do you want to give them the kinds of things that they would use if they were going to go into industry? So that what will happen? Like at this point, how do you do what he's even talking about?
This is an interesting thought. So if we are deindustrialized and defarmized, why educate anybody at all?
Oh, why did you say it? You're not supposed to say that. You can think it. You're not supposed to say that, Karl. Shit, that's the end of the show.
Well, I mean, you have all these schools. We need to do something with them.
Yeah, so you've seen a move towards acculturation in schools. Well, maybe that's the only thing they can do now. Maybe. If you're a Deweyist, if you're a progressive educator, maybe that's the only thing they can do. Like home economics, what are you going to do with that? 70% of food comes prepared.
Like Uber Eats. I can't understand Uber Eats. I probably complained about that already. If I complained about that?
Not enough.
Not enough. I occasionally work at a gym in Chicago, and many of the people that come to the gym, they think nothing about using an app to hire somebody to drive to a restaurant and bring them a sandwich.
Right.
Hire somebody. That's 3 steps too many. Or at least 2 steps. Just go get the I don't understand why you wouldn't just drive yourself. But everything's divorced from the production, so you don't need to teach anybody how to do the product. For me, one of the big errors of Dewey, there's a bigger one. One of the big errors is what you call the chicken and an egg problem. How do you educate people for a future whose shape you do not know?
That is not the critical error I see.
No.
But it is a critical error.
Might as well teach them COBOL and coding.
Yeah, what do you know is but see, he's an elite, so he can... Okay, so here's the thing. Pose your question again, if you can.
Wait, which one?
How do you know what future to...
How do you know how to educate people for a future the shape of which is unknown?
Well, what if you're Dewey and you believe that you have some say in what that future will be?
Well, then maybe you could do it. That would require control of the future.
What?
This is another one of these quiet things. You said the quiet part out loud.
Yeah. I think that he believes that through science, trademark, and proper training, I think that he believes that we now control history. I think that underlies what he's saying. I don't know that he wrote a lot of pages, man. I mean, Dewey's corpus of work is enormous, and I am no Dewey scholar. I'm not a scholar much.
That sounds so depressing. Who would be a Dewey scholar?
They're out there. I suspect that he believes that in this new era, we can pick up the reins of history and steer it.
I don't remember him saying that in this essay. But if you're going to make an education that fits the needs of the modern world, it seems to me that that's a hidden premise, that you have to therefore determine what the needs of the modern world will be.
Yeah. He says, we differ from the liberal arts folk. He says, we differ profoundly from the belief that the evils and defects of our system spring from excessive attention to what is modern in human civilization, science, technology, contemporary social issues, and problems. Rather, we rest our own critical estimate of the present educational situation upon a belief that the factors that correspond to what is living in present society, the factors that are shaping modern culture, are either confusedly smothered by excessive attention to the old or are diverted into channels in which they become technical and relatively illiberal in comparison with what they would be if they were given the central position. I begin then with the fact that we are now being told that a genuinely liberal education would require return to the models, patterns, and standards that were laid down in Greece some 2,500 years ago and renewed and put into practice in the best age of feudal medievalism 6 and 7 centuries ago. It is true that a theory of education using the word liberal as applied to an education having nothing to do with the practical was formulated in Greece. From Greece, we inherit the tradition that puts liberal and mechanical education in sharp opposition to each other, a fact to be noted. Identifies as mechanical anything and everything concerned with industry and useful commodities and services.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Next page. As was proper, a liberal or free education was the education of a free man in the Athenian community. But this has to be placed alongside the fact, totally improper from the standpoint of modern democratic communities, that free citizens were few in number and that their freedom had a large servile class as its substratum. Okay. Dewey, listen to me. I know you're in hell right now, but I think you can hear me.
Well, that means that our podcast is played down there.
Oh, well, it's torture for these guys like this, you see. So listen, Dewey, what if the servile class had a liberal education? Would that then render them more fit for self-government? Huh? Is the fact that they were the servile class in any way related to the kind of education that they were denied? It's not the sole factor, I understand that. Getting to talk with Socrates didn't automatically, make you fit for governance or whatever. And the people that did talk to Socrates, I've read the dialogues, aren't all fit for governance either. But is there any relationship between the kind of education that some people got and the one that was denied others that may have had a role in placing them in society?
Well, I had a different objection to this.
Okay.
So he says free citizens were few in number and their freedom had a large servile class as its substratum. I just wrote, well, yes.
Right. So what?
Is there not a large servile class?
Oh, well, he permanently wants to make them servile by giving them nothing but technical trainings.
Well, there's a premise. This is just like Hutchins. They share this premise that democracy is an ultimate good.
Yeah.
Well, if you're going to make democracy work, this is where I think Hutchins is right to hit him on this, wrong in his ultimate conclusion. But if you're going to make democracy make sense, you can't have a non-liberally educated populace.
Nope.
Because they won't understand what they're voting on.
And if you can't if you are kind of like Dewey and you're not sure that you can have a liberally educated populace, then maybe you can't have the democracy.
Yeah.
Maybe.
But that's unthinkable.
Right.
What does it matter that Athens, well, for one thing, I don't know that...
Who they granted the franchise to?
Yeah. Does that change whether you ought to study geometry and astronomy and music and what's the fourth one? I'm thinking of the traditional
arithmetic,
liberal arts.
Oh my gosh, you're asking for the quadrivium. I don't know. Let's look it up. I'm still working on the first three. I don't have time for the other five. The other three. Geometry, astronomy, arithmetic, and the musics. Plus, of course, you're already building on grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Yeah, and so in order to make this a stronger claim, this is where I started to get angry that he's playing dirty here. This is the kind of crap so you love your mother, huh? You know who else loved his mother? Hitler.
Oedipus. Oh.
Just trying to make the classical liberal arts be necessarily tied to slavery.
Yeah.
And I don't think they are, unless you think that having people be liberally educated necessarily results in them having slaves or having a servile class, and therefore we shouldn't educate anybody. Maybe that's the thought, that raising people above makes everybody else go down.
Maybe.
Yeah, but anyway, I think it's a dirty trick.
Mid-page 263. Again, talking about the people of Athens who had the voting franchise. They were free to do so because they lived upon the fruits of the labor of an industrial enslaved class.
Mm-hmm.
How many people in the United States do not own a crescent wrench or a hammer? How many people in the United States do not understand the difference between a gasoline or a diesel engine? How many people in the United States cannot repair their toilet? And on and on and on. Like, there is a servile class that is making all this stuff happen. And just because you let them take a wage doesn't mean they're not a servile class. This guy, Karl, if you pay them a penny, they're not a slave. Like, if they get money, it's not a slave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there you go, saying the quiet stuff out loud again. Yeah.
It's all mutually agreed upon and mutually beneficial, You get $12.50 an hour, and then now listen. I make $185 a year, $185,000 a year. But the building superintendent guy, the one that changes the light bulbs in the hall, he gets $12.50 an hour, which works out to around $25,000. But we give him free rent; he can stay in the building for free. But then he gets $12.50 an hour.
Oh, but we do more than that, because we say, your car is $30,000, Mr. Maintenance Supervisor. So
right.
You're going to be in debt for that. And you want to have a house so that you're not paying rent? Well, if you're paying rent, what happens if you don't pay rent?
Don't have where to live.
Yeah. You want to buy a house? Well, that's going to be $250,000 at least. You want to send your kids to college? Because college is the way to be an elite. Well, what do you have to do? My alma mater, I believe the last time I checked, and I don't check very often because they're dead to me, but I think it's $60,000 a year. I got 5 kids. There's no way.
Karl shouldn't have had 5 kids. It's just too expensive to have children. Like, maybe you should have had any.
There's reasons for that.
Yeah. And listen, I'm no communist or anything, but what is he talking about? Like, is there not a servile class?
Sure.
Of course there's
the point I'm making
class.
is that it's a debt class.
Yeah.
And so maybe you pay him $12.50 an hour, and so he's not enslaved. Okay.
And then you claw all of it back, but $1.
Yeah.
I looked up the other day. The average American household has around $1,700 a month worth of discretionary income. Now, disposable income is your income after taxes. Discretionary is after you've met your obligations for rent, food, and other things.
Mm-hmm.
So 17, I think it was 17 in the 1720 area, $1,720, I think. But half of Americans have discretionary income of under $250 a month. So these people are meeting their obligations for food, shelter, utilities, clothing, etc., and have $60 a week extra.
Mm-hmm. But it's not a servile class.
But it's not a servile class.
Yeah.
Good times. Yeah, we go on down the page. It's going to take forever. They always do. He starts making the argument that methods of work. So I'll just quote him. Methods of work are now the result of continuous application of science. Inventions, themselves the result of applications of science, are constantly encroaching upon ways of production that carry over routine and precedent. There was justification in existing conditions for the Greek, who distinguished between activities that were manifestation of rational insight or science and those that were the expression of irrational routine, but there is no excuse for such a view in the present time. There is now more natural science involved in the conduct of our industry than there is anything nearly resembling science in the conduct of our political and social affairs.
Equivocation.
Dewey is wrong about this.
Well, and he's equivocating. Okay, so I'll go first. So he's doing a very common modern thing to hypostasize the science to make it into a thing. Talking about the Greeks distinguishing between activities that are manifestations of rational insight and those that are the expression of irrational routine. You know, the science that is being used in industry is baked in.
Well, and it's not science, it's engineering.
Right.
Thomas Edison was not a scientist. He was an engineer. He tried stuff and did destructive testing until he got the light bulb to stay on. Mm-hmm. That's not actually science. It's engineering. It's a technical approach, not a theoretical one.
Well, and even so, it's a science that what he's talking about is a science that does not comprehend the final cause.
Right.
So there you are working you've been progressively educated into using science into advancing human prosperity or whatever. But what's human prosperity? That's a question about ends.
Yeah, advancing towards what? That's always the question.
And this is where the liberal education is not content. It's not content. Liberal education, I mean, we use content, but it's being able to establish your own ends, to figure them out, to determine what is true, good, and beautiful, and go towards it. If you don't have that, you don't even know why you're working in the factory.
Oh, gosh, we're going to have to read some Maslow. If your discretionary income is $250 a month or less, those folks, and maybe this is to Dewey's point, maybe, those folks are having a hard time moving up the hierarchy of needs, right, towards self-actualization. I think Dewey would say, okay, then, why are we making all these self-actualization mouth noises at these people? They just need to be trained in such a way that maybe they can make more, they're more productive, and we can get that $250 a month in discretionary income to go to $350.
Well, even discretionary income. So you have your $250 a month. What should you spend it on?
Right. Sure.
So this word should, or what we say ought, I like ought in English better because it's, believe it or not, the past tense of owe. What do you owe to spend it on? This becomes a question of, again, the end. What is a human being? What does it mean to be a flourishing human being? You figure that out first, and then you can work out with the science ways to make that happen. It doesn't go the other way around. For me, this is the big error. For me, the biggest error that he makes is he seems to think that the science, he doesn't capitalize it or put the in front of it, but modern people do, that the science will tell you how to live. And it does no such thing. No.
Let me simplify some of his argument, maybe too much, somebody might say, but I still think this simplified version of his argument needs to be addressed. 1943 is different than 1843.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of work is available in 1843? Almost entirely agricultural.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1843, There may be some one-room schoolhouses. It's very common to go to school maybe half as long each year than we do now and stop around 12 years old. Very common. Maybe 10 years old. Well, now it's 1943. You can go work down at the bomber plant. You can make vacuum tubes for RCA. There are electricians. There was no such thing. There's so much happening that didn't happen in 1843. If everything is so much different and we've got young people coming, what do you do? Do you continue to do the same stuff? Do you continue to do the same way in terms of education?
Well, if you're asking me, what I would have done, the liberal education part of it, the grammar, logic, rhetoric, that's so that the person can figure out what the good is. That's the whole point. I think Dewey's right in his first sentence when he said that if you want to know what a philosophy values, ask them how they would educate children. Well, I would educate children by doing my best to see that they love good things. I think that's the whole job of education. Everything after that is learning how to turn a wrench.
Even reading, writing, and arithmetic, you think?
Yeah. That's the point of it.
Yeah.
I mean, reading literature is, it's pleasant on its own. It has its own value, but you ought to like the stuff that is good, and you ought to not like the stuff that is not good.
Okay. Can people who do not have a notion of the good actually educate the young such that they can appreciate the good or that they seek it?
If you don't know what it is, how do you even know where to point them?
Yeah.
I mean, you'd have them reading 50 Shades of Grey for their literature.
Or To Kill a Mockingbird. I think at some point we ought to try to find a way to do a show about homeschooling. You and I have had very, very different approaches. Yours is a much more rigorous approach than ours. We basically unschooled ours for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Or longer.
And your children are monsters.
Right. Oh, yeah. I think that my kids know the good when they see it and reject the bad when they encounter it. And I think yours do too. So how does that happen? Through the two different approaches, how does that happen? I think that would be an interesting show to talk about. I have my ideas about that. But Dewey's not concerned with that at all, though, Karl.
He doesn't see it as a problem. I think he presumes that it's obvious or somehow.
Well, progress is good. Science is good.
Yeah.
Your job is good. Democracy's good.
I could pick at him for his historical errors. 264, he thinks medieval society had no political citizenship and no community life in the civic sense.
So dumb.
I think that's untrue. I think you read Dante, you'll find that that's certainly untrue. I got to go to the end. I'm digging up a quote here. See, this is me using my notes. I talked about not using your notes. I'm going to use my notes. 275. The problem is a concrete one. How shall this and that definite factory and field operation be made to contribute to the educative release and growth of human capacities, as well as to production of a large and reasonably cheap supply of material goods? So I wrote the good, ? Because I'm trying to figure out what he thinks the good is. Because as Thomas Aquinas says, and you should believe him on this, that the end is first in conception and last in execution. You figure out what you're going for, and then everything else follows. If you say, I want to marry that girl, well, then you start getting a haircut and getting in shape and talking to her, But the first thing you think is, I want to marry that girl. So the end comes first, and then all of the means come second. So he's got two things here. The educative release and growth of human capacities. That's the meaning of life. We want to take your human capacities and release them and grow them.
So that we have production of a large and reasonably cheap supply of material goods.
Well, he doesn't say the so that. He says as well as.
As well as. Well, yeah, he doesn't say that. That's not fair of me. As well as. But he puts those in parallel. The problem is one that, by its own terms, can be dealt with only by the continuous application of the scientific method of experimental observation and test. Those who feel in need of specific example of the connection between science and morals, between natural facts and human values, will find it here.
Mm-hmm. It seems obvious to him. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, what are these human capacities? Should I want to grow them? Epicurus writes about this. Epicurus is the hedonist philosopher, the one that says that pleasure is the greatest good. And so you would think he's like Hugh Hefner type, but he's not at all. The guy lives like a monk.
He's not.
He lives in the garden and eats. For him, pleasure is a little cheese. We have one of his letters. Please send me a pot of cheese. But he distinguishes there are natural pleasures and unnatural pleasures. The unnatural pleasures, because they have no natural limit, they go on forever. Well, they're both human capacities. How do I distinguish between them? How do I distinguish between the viewing of a beautiful sunset and the pursuit of sexual degeneracy? Is one of them good and one of them not?
Well, experimental inquiry and first-hand observation should get us there, Karl. He says it on 267.
Well, and if you can't figure that out, how do you know what... He says material goods. Okay.
Yeah, goods. It's in it.
What makes it a good?
God.
What makes it a good... Dear listener, we don't post a video on YouTube. Scott's having some trouble. How do you know it's a good thing? If only we make more smartphones.
At a low price.
At a low price. So everybody can be connected to the porno web internet instantly. Is that a good? How do you know if it's a good? How do you know that it's not a good? If you don't have a conception of human nature, maybe I'm wrong, maybe it is a good. But if you don't have a conception of human nature, in other words, if you don't know the formal cause and the final cause of the human being, you can't answer these questions. And if John Dewey had had a liberal education and had studied Aristotle's four causes, he wouldn't make this incredibly stupid blunder.
Well,
unless it was intentional.
I think it's intentional, Karl. We can go look at his educational background. We know how old he is. He almost certainly read some Aristotle in the Greek. He almost certainly read Homer. Knowing where he went to school and his age, he got this sort of education. Now, he's writing this at over 80 years old. So he got that education 60 years ago, 55, 60 years ago, 65 years ago. And he may have forgotten.
That's generous.
Yeah, right. So this is one of the reasons why I recommend, Karl, that we read Memoirs of a Superfluous Man by Nock. He gets this kind of an education, and then he sees the progressives doing these things, and he sees himself, tongue-in-cheek, as superfluous, but he actually knows that the liberally educated person is the person that is best suited for proper society and proper life. That's kind of what the book is about, and it's published right around the same time when after the progressives had their claws in society for 30 years or something like that.
You know what? So I want to diverge a little bit. So we have some liberally educated people at OGB, or at least who are getting there, are doing their best. We're not reading them in Greek and Latin, which is the way you would do it 150 years ago. But, we're having people read Aristotle and Plato and Homer, and you see what they do. So being able to determine ends for yourself, no, that's the wrong way. Being able to attempt to recognize the true, the good, and the beautiful, and then make those be your ends. That's a better way to say it. Okay. Does not make you into a Northeastern elite necessarily. It might make you plant carrots. We got a whole bunch of people that are doing this sort of thing that would be better able to speak on human nature and the end goal of being a human than the World Economic Forum. And they're planting taters.
So Karl maybe coined the phrase the potato pill.
Yes.
At some point.
It has a ring to it.
But it doesn't. And me being who I am, I have said tater pill. And it seems as though the tater pill is getting some traction versus the potato pill. And I can't help but notice that Karl didn't say potato just now, but said carrot. You're going to change it because you hate that so much. You're going to change it to like the turnip tablet.
The carrot capsule.
Or the carrot capsule. Yes, something like that. Yeah. But see, this is one of the things, well, he says on 266 that historical illiteracy is thus the outstanding trait of those critics who urge return to the ideas of the Greek medieval period as the ideas of the two ages were the same, but because philosophers of the medieval period used some of the verbal formulas set forth by the philosophers of the early period. No, wrong. He is the one that has the historical illiteracy. I don't think he understands the nature of the life of the common person of the medieval period as I understand it. I understand in many ways that they would have been freer and would have had fewer pressures on them to pursue something that they did not see as the good.
Mm-hmm.
And the Greeks largely gave us the liberal education. Now, he calls them verbal formulas. No, it's a way of thinking. It's a model for understanding the world that continued through the medieval period. They aren't just formulas. It's a specific way of thinking and understanding things. And it's a self-reliant way of seeing things. You know, where Thomas starts with his understanding of motion and builds an entire theology.
Mm-hmm.
He has more ideas than that. But, you know, like Euclid starts with the definition of a point and then builds an entire geometry on it, Thomas talks about motion and then builds an entire theology upon that by sitting on his tuffet and using these quote-unquote verbal formulas to understand the nature of the universe. And the truth of it is Dewey can't stand for somebody to have that kind of horsepower. I don't think he even knew it, but I think if we could somehow give him some sodium pentothal and ask him or hypnotize him with a pocket watch or something, I think we would have gotten that from him.